Hello and welcome everyone to today's event. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies. Today we're talking about Afghanistan then and now, Afghanistan lives then and now. And usually I'm starting our events by articulating, a pleasure about hosting the event. I have to say I have very mixed feelings today because of course the context in which we find ourselves is not one to celebrate. At the same time, I also want to say that of course we've all been complicit over the past years, really over the past 20 years, in ignoring developments in Afghanistan, because while Afghanistan is now in the media, people inside Afghanistan have been experiencing hardship, have been displaced, have experienced various forms of violence, including gender-based violence, both in terms of the impact of the US-led military intervention, as well as local political forces and constituencies. So what we want to do today is really focus on the experiences of people in Afghanistan. We are reading a lot in the media and we're hearing about, the failure of the US. I mean, this is one narrative, of course, in terms of the post 9/11 war on terror. And, many of us are, of course, very critical of US intervention in Afghanistan and later on in Iraq. But what often gets missing in these narratives and discourses and representations is actually the experiences of people in Afghanistan and of course refugees in the diaspora. So what we're hoping today is, focus on that, and I'm very pleased to welcome three speakers today, who all, of course, in the current context, must be very busy and stressed and still have agreed to participate today. Our first speaker is Mishgan Masumi. Mishgan is a historian with teaching and research interest focused on the connective histories of media, sound, and popular culture across modern South and Central Asia and the Middle East. In June of 2021, she received her PhD in history from Stanford University. Beginning in August of 2021, she started as a teaching fellow in the college program at Stanford University. Her work incorporates questions regarding technology and citizenship, transnationalism, and the fluidity of identity, gender, and performance, critical approaches to global history, post-colonial studies, and sensory history. As a scholar and educator, as well as refugee and immigrant, she is committed to advancing a culture of equity and inclusion within academia through her activism and advocacy for diversity, as well as her teaching and scholarship focused on the study of history through the experiences of marginalized peoples, places, and cultures. Welcome, Mishgan. And I'm really, really happy to welcome Valentin Mugaddam. Professor Valentin Mugaddam is a professor of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University. I've known Valentin for a long time, actually through AMUS, the Association of Middle East Women Studies. She was president of the association, and so we've been, I think, over the years, been following each other's work and seeing each other at various events. So I'm very happy to welcome you today. Professor Mugaddam was born in Tehran, in Iran. She received her higher education in Canada and the US. In addition to her academic career, Professor Mugaddam has been Senior Research Fellow and Coordinator of the Research Program on Women and Development in Helsinki from 1990 to 95, and Section Chief for Gender Equality and Development, Human and Social Science Sector, UNESCO in Paris from 2004 to 2006. She is the author of many, many journal articles, 5 books, and co-author of 1. She has co-edited 9 books. So I'm very, very happy to welcome you, Valentin. Then I'm also grateful that Arash Azizada has agreed to contribute today. Arash is a writer, photographer, and community organizer. The child of Afghan refugees, Arash is deeply committed to social justice and building communities. He currently lives in Los Angeles. He's a co-founder of the Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress in 2016, which is aiming to elevate and empower change makers within the community. He also recently launched the Afghans for a Better Tomorrow campaign and has focused on evacuation coordination efforts across the diaspora, as well as ending US military engagement in Afghanistan. And I know he'll tell us more about that. At this moment, I want to turn our attention to Valentin, who is going to shift gear quite a bit, and she's going to provide us with some of the historical context, looking at the period after 79, revolution, counter-revolution, and compare that era following this historical moment with the post 9/11 and war on terror moment or period. So over to you, Valentin.
Thank you so much, Nadia. It's such a pleasure to join you and the other panelists. I must thank also Mojgan for that wonderful presentation. As I was listening and watching, it really pulls at one's heartstrings. And, inshallah, people will still be able to listen to music and play music and to sing, but, it doesn't look very promising right now. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, which I believe should be able to be shared. I thought that, as Nadia just mentioned, I thought that I would try to place Afghanistan in a much broader historical and also comparative context. I mean, people talk about the past 20 years of the American presence in Afghanistan, but the history of the problem of Afghanistan is actually much older. It's at least 40 years old. So I wanted to provide some context. First, the next slide, please. I wanted to place what happened in Afghanistan in the late 1970s in a broader context of revolutions and counter-revolutions in the 1970s. This really was the era of revolutions, and I think that some people in the audience may be aware of that, but it was also the period of the era of the Cold War. And so every time a revolution, especially a left-wing or socialist revolution took place, there was also reaction and a counter-revolution. So the 1970s, of course, begins with, well, the Americans are still in Vietnam, they're trying to win the war, but eventually they lose. And as they're losing that war, they turn their attention to Chile, where, of course, you have a rather brutal military coup that takes place, which, of course, the United States supports and endorses. And that was the coup d'etat by General Pinochet against the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende. But at the same time, we see these rumblings in other parts of the third world. In Portugal, for example, in April of 1974, we have a military revolt by soldiers and officers, Portuguese soldiers and officers in the African colonies. And this is taking place in the context of a kind of a rebellion and revolt against the draft, these decades of drafting young men to fight in what really was an endless but also a futile war for Portugal and the Portuguese fascistic military government to retain its colonies. So the Angolan War of Independence, which started in the 1970s, finally succeeds in 1974-75 at the same time that the Portuguese officers rebel and revolt, precipitating that famous Portuguese revolution of the carnations. But as soon as that happens, as soon as Angola receives its independence under a left-wing government, the MPLA, the US, Zaire, and South Africa intervene to undermine this left-wing modernizing pro-Soviet government led by the MPLA. So this, by the way, echoes what happens. It suggests what will follow 4 years later in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Portugal was the first of a series of countries that comprised what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democratization. So Greece in July of 1974, that's when we see the fall of the colonel's regime. Spain, the following year, the start of its democratic transition once the Franco regime falls. And in Vietnam, the very same year, the Americans lose the war and withdraw from Saigon. And I think people have seen those pictures, those photos, those videos of the American withdrawal from Saigon and their Vietnamese allies trying to hang on and so on and so forth. Again, echoes of what happens many years later in Afghanistan just last month. The next revolution that takes place, of course, is that of Iran, which was rather a different revolution to, for example, what had been going on in Yemen in the 1970s. Again, another socialist revolution, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which brought us a very egalitarian family reform program and women's rights. But in Iran in 1979, a very different revolution takes place. And although it began in 78, 79 as a broad cross-class populist revolution with many different types of political tendencies, including left-wing, communist, etc., the Islamists very quickly take over and just turn in a different direction altogether. Later that year, there was the hostage crisis, which begins these decades of a very fraught relationship and basically no diplomatic ties between the U.S. and Iran. The Iran-Iraq War takes place during the 1980s too. It's important to note that the United States supported Iraq in that rather brutal 8-year war. And of course, Iran, fought on its own, and there were terrible casualties on both sides. The Nicaraguan War, of course, the Nicaraguan Revolution takes place with the Sandinista victory. Once again, the U.S. turns against this left-wing government and supports the counter-revolution and the Contra War. So that's the context in which, that's the broad 1970s context in which the Afghan revolution takes place. Now, some people call it a military coup, but similar to what had occurred in Portugal in 74, in Afghanistan, also you see a revolt on the part of officers in the Afghan military. And this precipitates what is called the Tsar Revolution, the April Revolution of April 1978. But again, immediately there is reaction and counter-revolution, both within Afghanistan and outside it as well. The very first rebellion takes place in the summer of 1978, actually in July. CIA covert action begins very early on. I think a lot of people think that it really was something that followed the Soviet intervention in December of 1979. That's not the case. There were plans to overthrow the left-wing government of Afghanistan much earlier. CIA covert action begins at least, and this is what is documented, in March of 1979. In the 1980s, following the Soviet intervention in December of 1979, and I'll say something about that in a moment, the U.S. launches what is called Operation Cyclone, supporting the Mujahideen, sending all kinds of weaponry, including Stinger missiles via Pakistan. And all kinds of other countries are intervening too, mainly on the side of the Mujahideen. Now, the U.S. support for the Mujahideen during that period, the fact that the U.S. was opposed to a left-wing modernizing government in the late 1970s, the fact that the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen in the 1980s really shows you that the rights of women and girls were disposable. There was nothing of interest to the Americans with respect to the rights of women and girls. And that's the case after 2001 as well, and I'll get to that in a moment. So if we just go to the next slide, please. Here I want to just go back and very briefly explain what that social program of the ruling party, the left-wing party that came to power in April of 1978 was. So this is what we are calling the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan under the leadership of the Democratic People's the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA. And their reform program included some things which, frankly, were rather audacious and radical for Afghanistan, given that Afghanistan was still very tribal, very rural. But some of the programs were not at all radical and audacious. Because, for example, the land reform program, we in Iran had a land reform program in the 1960s. And it went fairly smoothly and it was very successful. And basically the government of Iran purchased land from many of the large landowners and then distributed the land to the former peasants, the feudal peasants. But nothing like that had happened in Afghanistan. And of course, one of the elements of the social reform program was precisely land reform. Another one was compulsory schooling. This in a country where the vast majority, 98% of the population was illiterate. Girls, to the extent that they went to school at all, if there were any schools in their areas, were taken out of school very early on and they're prepared for marriage. This was also a context of very high rates of maternal, child, and infant mortality. So the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan came in April of 1978, and they said, okay, yes, we recognize that over the preceding 20 years, the 60s and 70s, there had been peace and stability, in our country, but there had been no development and no modernization, and there were all these problems. And so they decided that they would have equality of nationalities, and that was a very important one in a country that had almost a caste-like system with respect to the ethnic groups, where at the very bottom were the Hazaras, the Shia Hazaras. They instituted rights for women and girls, and they also banned certain, traditional but highly regressive practices such as usury, excessive bride price, and forced marriage. And they also ended child marriage. So immediately you have opposition. Obviously, the landlords and the landowners opposed land reform, because 80% of the land at the time in Afghanistan was owned by these big landlords. So obviously they were opposed to that. Rural patriarchs were completely opposed to compulsory schooling, especially for their daughters. And of course, the mullahs were opposed to everything. I do have to mention that there was political dysfunction and difficulties within the ruling party as well. There were two wings or two factions, basically, of the ruling People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Khalq faction and the more moderate Parcham faction. Nur Muhammad Taraki was the first president, and his deputy, Hafizullah Amin, they were from the more radical faction, but they also began to fight each other. It's a very complicated and very sad episode in which under Amin's orders, Taraki is actually killed. Meanwhile, the elements within the moderate Parcham faction had been appealing to the Soviet Union, their fraternal party, to please extend assistance, given the fact that the CIA was now engaging in more covert action. Pakistan was supporting the various rebellions, so was Saudi Arabia and China. The Soviet Union resisted for several months until finally in December of '79, they sent a contingent of soldiers. That contingent was actually supposed to simply bring some stability and then leave by March of 1980, in other words, by the Persian New Year. But of course, the American plan had been to create a Vietnam-style quagmire for the Soviet Union, and they succeeded in that. And this is something that Zbigniew Brzezinski admitted many years later in an article in a French magazine. So that happens. Taraki and Amin are killed. This Marhale Dovom, the second stage of the revolution under Babrak Karmal begins, and then what I call the Third Republic under Dr. Najibullah. So if we can go to the next slide, please. in this final slide, I'd like to just compare these two eras. The era of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and afterwards, and then the era of the American invasion, occupation, and withdrawal. You know, there's always this term that is used, Soviet invasion, Soviet invasion, Soviet invasion. But the genuine invasion was the American invasion in 2001, because in 1979, although it was a mistake for the Soviet troops to, the Soviet Red Army to intervene, and they conceded that later, obviously, they were actually appealed to and invited in. The US was never invited in 2001. So one was a Soviet intervention, the other one was the American invasion. But look at the context in which these two happened, because the context of the Third World Revolutions, which I mentioned, the PDPA social reform program, the Soviet intervention. One statistic that I think is really very interesting is that despite the internationalized civil conflict in the 1980s, despite the intervention of the US and the UK and China and Saudi Arabia and jihadists from all kinds of countries, who, by the way, went back to wreak havoc on their own countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. And of course, Pakistan. Despite that, the government kept building schools and they kept training teachers. Between 1978 and 1992, the rate of the proportion of secondary school teachers, can you imagine, that were female went from 20% to nearly 55%. If you look at the UNESCO statistics, that proportion declines after 1992, which was when the Mujahideen, when the Western-supported Mujahideen came to power. But then look at 2001 to 2021. The Mujahideen are supported by the United States. They come into power in 1992. They immediately start to fight each other. They practically destroy Kabul, which by 1992 had actually remained fairly intact. And there are some rather scandalous and horrid things that were happening, killings, rapes of girls and boys, and so on and so forth on the part of the warlords. Meanwhile, the Taliban, these religious, so-called religious students who had been raised in the refugee camps of Peshawar, are viewing with horror what is going on in their country, and they come rampaging in. By 1994, by 1996, they have taken control of the country. So they want to clean up the area of their country. But of course, they institute their own draconian, almost medieval era type of system of Islamic justice. They also harbor Osama bin Laden. However, in the 1990s, Hamid Karzai, who later becomes the first president of Afghanistan, tries to, after 2001, tries to make a deal with the Taliban for a gas pipeline from Uzbekistan through Afghanistan, which would be built by a California-based company, Unical. That fell through by the late 1990s, but it was something that President Hamid Karzai, at the time he was not a president, he was actually working with Unical, and also Zalmay Khalilzad were promoting and endorsing. But because the Taliban were sponsoring and were hosting Osama bin Laden, the United States decides against that plan and slowly but surely completely turn against the Taliban. So what's the context in which the United States invades, occupies, and eventually withdraws from Afghanistan? We've got this post-Soviet US-led neoliberal world order. We've got the expansion of Islamist movements and organizations around the world. That includes, by the way, 1990s in Algeria. Some of those jihadists who were wreaking havoc in Algeria and in Egypt and in Jordan had actually fought in Afghanistan. So that's the sense in which the United States really has to bear some responsibility for the global expansion of Islamism and Islamist, radical extremist Islamism. Then we have the 9/11 attacks in the United States. Osama bin Laden is held responsible. The US invades and occupies Afghanistan. The war on terror is launched. Guantanamo prison opens in 2002. The Hamid Karzai government begins in 2002 and goes on until 2014. Again, this is the same gentleman who in the 1990s had tried to strike a deal with the Taliban, and today is also trying to strike a deal with the Taliban. Some of the people in the audience might be aware of that. The Taliban were defeated in 2001, 2, 3, etc., but they experienced a resurgence in 2006, at which point the US begins to increase their troop presence. The surges occur in 2008, 9, 10, as do drone attacks. These drone attacks and other types of military assaults were supposed to be targeting Taliban and other extremists, but in fact, many civilians died too. So the US was not able to win hearts and minds, let's put it that way. And of course, the Taliban are able to grow support within the countryside, if not in the cities, certainly in the countryside. The Ashraf Ghani government comes to power in 2014 in new elections, but it's a divided government too. And that's, that's another story in and of itself. Now, remember I mentioned that during the period of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan in the 1980s and until 1992, the proportion of secondary school teachers that was women reached 55%. During the period of the American occupation, the height of teacher female representation was 34%. So it had actually declined. And then, of course, we know what happened next. The Trump administration decides that it wants to end the endless war, which, of course, was an admirable objective, given that none of those US wars should ever have been started in the first place. But the handling of it was just appalling. No consultation with European allies, no consultation with Afghanistan's neighbors, and frankly, very little consultation with the government of Ashraf Ghani. So that is more or less the story, the kind of bigger picture over the past 40 years of both political developments in Afghanistan and the American role in Afghanistan, which, as I've argued, has predated the past 20 years and really goes all the way back to the Carter administration and that fateful decision under the Carter administration and through the influence of Zbigniew Brzezinski in particular to undermine a modernizing left-wing government and then to try to lure the Soviets into a Vietnam-style quagmire. So nothing has been done for women and girls by the American occupying forces. Definitely not back in the 1980s and certainly not in 2001. Yes, there was some progress, as Mojgan showed us too. There was room for maneuver, there was room for schooling and employment and music, etc. But that was very limited to some of the major cities. And in the countryside, hardly any of that has taken place. The vast majority of American treasure, as President Biden put it, over the past 20 years has really come back to the United States. Hardly any of it, something like 2% only, went to reconstruction and development, social, economic, and infrastructure development in Afghanistan. So there you go. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valentina. I want to come back to that last point you made in terms of women and girls, and also actually want to follow up with Meshgan, but I really appreciated you providing us with this broader historical context. I think one of the problems in the media representations and also sort of policy discourses is this presentism, this ahistorical approach. And of course, everything started with 9/11. And although this is an important historical moment, this is not when the history of either Afghanistan or US-Afghani relations started. And so it's very useful to also look at the wider historical era context, what were some of the dynamics. And I think the other point I'm taking away from your narrative, Valentin, is that, yes, you have the Soviet military intervention in the 70s, you have the US military invasion more recently, but there are all these local players as well. And I think, often there's also this sort of tendency to just explain Afghanistan, as was the case with Iraq as well, in terms of the US role. But of course, you have a very complex system of, as you say, different religious and ethnic groups, different political factions. Even within one political party, you have the different, strands. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I thank you for that. I'd like to remind the audience that you can put your questions or comments in the Q&A function. We will soon be opening up. Hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So I encourage you to do that. But now I'd like to hand the floor over to Arash. Arash, this is your turn now, please.
Thank you, Professor, and I'm honored to be here today. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you to the Center for Middle East Studies. It's always good to be amongst academics. I think community organizing, which I am, is done in tandem with the work that academics and academians do. And I think I'm not used to this style of format. I'm not a lecturer or anything, but what I do is tell the story of communities. Today I will tell the story of my community, and I'll try to personalize it a little bit. But I'm here as a member of the Afghan diaspora. I live in Los Angeles. Both my parents are from Afghanistan. Both were born in Kabul. I myself was born in the Netherlands in 1987. I am a product of displacement, and I am one of the lucky ones. I sit here in the comfort of a home here in sunny Los Angeles, where it's roughly between 70 and 85 degrees all year. But I am not here because I want to be. It's because I was forced to a variety of different forces. I'm willfully employed even in a pandemic, and I'm one of the lucky ones because I did not have to spend time in a refugee camp. I did not have to risk my life to be on a boat and try to make it to a Greek island. I did not have to walk to Western Europe. I did not have to stay behind in Afghanistan. I was not maimed by a landmine, left behind by the Soviets. I do not have PTSD from when the warlords rained rockets indiscriminately on Kabul in the civil war of the early 90s. I did not lose a family member to one of the Taliban's indiscriminately bastardly attacks. I do not have to stay up at night and wonder if the sound that I'm hearing over the house is an American drone. I did not lose any family members or friends to an attack by ISIS because they were Hazara or Shia. And so I sit here in front of you, and I'm glad that Mushgan John and the other esteemed folks could have kind of give context about the culture and the history of Afghanistan. But conflict is what defines me the most as a human being, unfortunately. And I do not want that to be the story of me, Afghans, or my community, but that is where we're at in this very moment. I'm 33 years old. Almost a full 2 decades of those two were spent watching administration after administration here in the US, justifying the occupation of Afghanistan. And America's involvement stretches beyond my own life. The United States, as was just discussed, has been heavily involved in shaping the conflict there beyond my lifetime. And so now in 2021, we find ourselves in probably the biggest crisis in 20 years. We are seeing Afghanistan turn into a failed state. We can do that. We can watch that happen quite dramatically on our cell phones and our laptops, and through conversations we're having through WhatsApp and FaceTime with folks back in Afghanistan. Roughly 500,000 people are displaced just this year. 1/3 of the population of Afghanistan does not know where their next meal will come from. The IMF and the World Bank have frozen assets. The Afghan economy is in full collapse. Banks are currently not releasing more than a certain amount of money per person. From our estimates, 250,000 to 1.1 million Afghans currently are in immediate threat of retribution, if not more, due to their prior work with the occupation in some capacity. And so while the Biden administration these past few weeks has claimed this has been the most successful airlift, I wish I could invite folks to come see and look at some of our inboxes, our social media, our Instagram, our Twitter, our emails. The text messages we get, the messages we get on WhatsApp, and the phone calls we receive from people desperate for evacuation currently. These messages are continuing. I understand that the spotlight, especially in the media, is moving on from Afghanistan because we are now focused on whatever else is in the next, whether it's the Met Gala or something else. But the messages are not ending, and the desperation is not ending. That continues for the folks on the ground. I think we can sit here and kind of analyze why the occupation failed and where it went wrong. But I think one of the most disastrous parts of it is that it lasted for so long, which means it touched so many people. And that's what makes this current situation so dangerous for somebody who's sitting here in safety, in refuge, who enjoys human dignity, who's trying to assist folks, as many folks in our community are, to give those same three things to folks currently in Afghanistan. There's those who immediately work for US military, either as interpreters or otherwise. There are members of the Afghan National Defense Forces. There are those who are women activists and human rights defenders. These are outspoken former government officials, members of the media. These are from marginalized communities such as the Hazaras, the Shias, the disabled, the youth, the social media influencers, the businessmen. All these people are currently at risk and seeking some type of evacuation. Many of the people that I am currently in touch with, many of which are now my friends, they grew up in a post-Taliban world. They grew up in some of the major metropolitan cities in Afghanistan, specifically Kabul, but they did not grow up with a Taliban in Afghanistan. And so the United States has put all these folks vulnerable and under threat from retribution and from Taliban, as well as Daesh or ISIS and other violent and repressive groups. And so the moment we find ourselves in, specifically in the last 4 weeks or so, is that we are doing the jobs that institutions failed to do. We are doing the jobs that our government failed to do. We are doing the jobs that other people were supposed to do. And so me, myself, other members of our community, folks who have connections back in Afghanistan, members of the nonprofit world, veteran groups, members of the private sector, we're all coming together on a very ad hoc basis to try to evacuate people that we cherish, that we love, but also just people we, quite frankly, have never spoken to before or have never met before. But we understand that, you know, the value of a human life is not just because of accomplishments they've made. I understand there's a lot of people who are able to leverage connections and people that they've met over the past 20 years. But the people that are in our inboxes specifically, they don't have any leverages. They're just merely students. They are merely members of a society. They are merely human beings, and they just happen to be Afghan. And I tell people, being Afghan is the greatest gift I've ever received on this planet. And being Afghan is the greatest curse I've ever received on this planet. And that's the emotion that Afghans, I think many of us now currently feel. So I'm a community organizer. And I think that is also because I am Afghan. I feel that's not a choice. That's just because I have to do what I have to do. And in the past 4 weeks, especially, I think every Afghan is a community organizer. You know, we're all organizing. We are all becoming immigration lawyers. We're all becoming experts on evacuations. We're becoming experts on how to charter flights. You know, people were asking me, how can I help? And I said, charter me a flight. And that's quite literally, that is not an exaggeration. That is exactly what we needed in that very moment. We are figuring out how resettlement works. We are realizing that we need donation drives. We are becoming lobbyists within the US government, at the United Nations and beyond, becoming media experts. We're becoming spokespeople. We are learning that the immigration policy, for example, in the US and the world is quite different from the ones that my parents, for example, were able to take advantage of. This is a far more hostile world to refugees than it ever was before. And so I'm one of the lucky ones, and my parents, and they experienced trauma and pain and displacement, and they too are somehow one of the lucky ones. And so our community is doing the job that nobody else is able to do, is not willing to do. And we are coming together and also doing what we do best, which is in this moment is opening our doors. We are kind of doing what my family has taught us to do as Afghans, which is to open your home, which is to make people feel at home, to treat them better than you would treat yourself. And so that's what we are doing in this moment, or attempting to do. And I think, you know, there's a lot of darkness, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of emotions that we all feel, but we are kind of all laser focused and putting all that aside to spend roughly 18 to 20 hours of our day trying to alleviate some pain, to reduce the harm that the US and others in the world have caused, including proxy sponsors of the Taliban, such as Pakistan. And, you know, the Taliban became this ugly tumor empowered by US imperialism. And I don't want to delve too much into it, but I think accountability is important. You know, in the past 20 years, the US has spent droning and killing people in rural areas where Clarissa Ward of CNN does not go, where non-Afghans write about rural villages, where bad actors were enabled, where the elite, the so-called warlords, which is not a phrase I love, but it's a popular term, militia leaders, it gave free rein to abusive men with power who were not representative of the Afghan people. It allowed corruption to run free from the highest to the lowest levels of government. And so in the end, the US built a rentier state, it built a ghost democracy, and I think it built ghost schools and a ghost army that collapsed. We saw kind of what happens when the US and the West and other powerful actors kind of are willing to turn away and are pretending that people don't exist when they don't value human life. And specifically what I've spent the past 20 years doing is try to let folks know the value of Afghan life in a variety of different ways. And I think one of the biggest lessons in the past few weeks is that unless we start valuing Afghan lives, this will continue. This cycle of darkness, this cycle of violence, this cycle of repression, it will continue. So I think my call to action, which is what I do as a community organizer as well, is to start valuing Afghan lives. Places of academia can be helpful in that. The media can be helpful in that. But there's 50 to 70,000 Afghans coming to the United States, for example. And whether you live in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., or Kansas, you're sure to interact with one of these Afghan refugees. And my call to action is to treat them like human beings. Don't treat them like Afghans. Don't treat them like refugees. They're merely human beings. You know, just treat them with the human dignity to deserve. And I think the kind of final note that I want to close on is that the story of Afghanistan, specifically in the past 20, 30, 40 years, is requires nuance. It requires study. It's complex. I think I'm trying to convey my feelings and a view of history, but it requires a lot of there's a lot of complexity and layers and nuance to it. But one thing that I saw when I went to Afghanistan was that Afghanistan was built by Afghans. You know, it had businesses, a thriving civil society, women activists that challenged cultural norms, and they built power in the rural countryside. These stories weren't ever told. And the US occupation did not do that. Afghans did that. And specifically Afghan women did that. Afghan Shias and Hazaras did that. And we are seeing that the West has turned it back on the Afghan people, has betrayed them, has abandoned them. It has stabbed them, quite frankly, in the front and not even in the back. The women activists I admire and look up to, they're sending me messages from military bases, from Wisconsin, New Jersey, and elsewhere. And I think I just want people to kind of grasp that, the fact that the people that I look at to as a shining light, as my inspiration as to what to do, my moral compasses, they sit in a military base here in the United States. That's a very painful thing to process for me. And I am not sitting, I'm sitting here enjoying refuge, a salary, safety, human dignity. And so I think what I want to kind of end on is that despite all the pain and tragedy, despite all this displacement, despite all these tragic stories, there are still Afghans in Afghanistan fighting for a better tomorrow. They're fighting for Afghanistan to be better than it was yesterday, for it to be better than it was last week. They're willing to take the streets. They're willing to face the Taliban's guns. They're willing to fight the Taliban's repression. And those people are speaking out loudly, boldly, courageously, without fear. That's where I find a drive to continue to do my work. And I hope other people find inspiration in that as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Arash, for really moving talk, but also, full of actually sort of concrete, tangible moments and information in terms of what people are facing. And, when I think about refugees, we're thinking about, you're speaking about the US, the number of people who might be allowed into the US. I'm thinking Europe, but what about Iran and Pakistan? I mean, that is also often forgotten, actually, the countries that have historically taken tens and tens of thousands of refugees, and the really hypocrisy in Western context of now bemoaning the brutality of the Taliban, but when it comes to welcoming refugees, what is going to happen then? So I very much appreciate your input here. There's a lot more to say, but I'm quite aware that time is an issue and there are lots of questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read out a few, let's say 3 questions, and then I'll invite you to reply to the one or ones that you feel like to. I mean, you don't all have to answer all of them because we have quite a number. So the first one is by Bianca Rosen, who's asking, how should the US be handling the Afghan refugee crisis? What does visa policy look like? So I guess I think it would be great if you could answer that. Mohammed Farouk is commenting and asking, so music, no doubt a powerful unifying force that's also romanticized as the voice of cultural collectivity, resistance, but music has gained new associations in Afghanistan and perhaps elsewhere too, in the context of 9/11, when on the one hand, it was used as an instrument of torture in Guantanamo, and on the other hand, most recent music in Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan has taken necro-imagery, suicide attacks, drones, etc., that perpetuates violence further. Also, the Taliban too have selectively used one type of musical lyrics for gaining support and opposed the other type that promote Afghani nationalism. How do you look at this complicated relationship of music and violence? So that's something I think, Mishkan, if you could answer that. And then I'm going to read out one other question by Grace Williams. What do you think is one main thing Brown students should be aware of about the current crisis in Afghanistan? And I guess we can say, people more broadly, students, but also, I guess, faculty. So maybe Val can say something, but anyone. So maybe Val, would you like to address any of the questions?
Sorry, are you addressing me, Nadia?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, let me address that last question from Grace about one thing that Brown students, or as you added, Americans in general, should come away with. And maybe I will say two things. One is that, and I've been writing about this in various papers and also in various other webinars. The United States does have to own up to its responsibility and accountability for 40 years of tragedy in Afghanistan and thwarting the ability of Afghan people to really develop their society in a sustainable and organic manner. So with that in mind, I think that the US should actually help create a trust fund, an international trust fund for Afghanistan's reconstruction and development to be supervised by the United Nations with conditions attached. In other words, that the release of funds to the Taliban government would be conditional on, for example, specific and measurable improvements in the status of women and girls in particular, for example, the health, schooling, and employment of Afghan women. That would be, one way that the Americans could really, the United States can really account for and compensate the way that they have helped to destroy an entire people and a country. And to that end, there's a recent paper, a letter that was just released today, I believe, from Senator Markey, Senator of Massachusetts, Senator Elizabeth Warren, I think Congressman Van Hollen of Maryland, a letter that was issued to the Biden administration asking for something similar to this, but with some other provisions as well. And I think the second thing that it would be very good for Brown students and for Americans in particular to come away with and to demand is that their government change the course of US foreign policy. No more interventions, no more destabilization of states. I mean, we've seen too many of those in recent years. Not only 2001 in Afghanistan, but 2003 in Iraq. And of course, Nadia has done so much work on that. 2011, Libya and Syria. And of course, the proliferation of refugees from the destabilization of all these states. We need a new foreign policy in America, a foreign policy that is based on diplomacy, peace, and international cooperation. Thanks.
Thank you, Val. Arash, would you like to address the question on the Afghan refugee crisis, please?
Yes, it's a good question because I don't know where to start and where to end with that question because the entire immigration system, specifically in the US, but also in Europe, is designed to reject, not to vet. For example, there's the Afghans that are now currently in the US who are probably numbering between 50 to 70,000 are lucky, but there is no legal pathway for them to receive currently legal status. And so some of our advocacy efforts revolve around that. And I think perhaps we find ourselves in a rather lucky moment, as badly as the way Biden administration has handled this. There seems to be some goodwill, not just politically, but socially for Afghans. I think this relationship between the US and Afghanistan, which was some of it was militarily, has allowed some goodwill to coexist. There's a pathway for Afghans to apply for some kind of parolee status in the US. That application is $575 per person. So some of our advocacy revolves around asking the administration and Department of Homeland Security to drop that $575 fee. Furthermore, for parolees, and it's a weird term, but that's what's being used. for them to, if they do eventually are able to get in on some type of evacuation flight, and they do make it to the US and they are sitting at a military base currently, they will receive a one-time stipend of around $1,100 in terms of benefits. But we're talking about people that are heavily traumatized, who have left almost everything behind, who bring with them a variety of other things that will be important, but none that are very tangible in the next 3, 6, or 12 months. So some of our advocacy revolves around having social services and other type of benefits that other refugees do get once they come to the US, but that these current parolees do not have access to. Evacuations that are happening, for example, in a variety of other manners. That means a lot of folks are trying to enter countries like Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, some of the other neighboring countries. The US can play a positive role or some kind of helpful role by pressuring those countries, A, to take in those refugees to some capacity, to either serve as a third country facilitation country, or to drop visa requirements. One of the issues that we're currently running into is that the Afghan passport is almost seen as the opposite of something that holds value. One of the few countries in the world where Afghans can travel to without a visa currently are countries like Haiti and Rwanda. So there's no host of obstacles that are in front of an Afghan person from Afghanistan in country who are trying to relocate themselves, trying to self-evacuate to some other country. Some of them are financial, some of them are political, and I think the US, and I think also the larger community, that can be the international community, that could be corporations, that could be academic institutions. I think there's a lot of there can be a lot of social push that can remove those obstacles and make life easier for refugees.
Yeah, thanks, Arash. So I'm going to read out a few more questions here. One by Ami and Spencer Bloom. Thank you for your talks. How would you reconcile many of the people who have been opposing US presence in Afghanistan for years suddenly crying out about the US leaving? How would you have envisioned a good withdrawal from Afghanistan? What is or should the US rule in relation to Afghanistan be now? Laila L is her question here to Professor Moghadam. Thank you for historicizing the US agenda in preventing communist rule in Afghanistan. I wonder if you can discuss the brutality of the DRA and the Soviet invasion and the diversity of the Mujahideen makeup, which isn't same as Taliban. The Western anti-imperial imaginary seems to completely erase the violence of the communist regime and Soviets, which we Afghans cannot. Afghan historians like Ali Olomi have made this point very well. I'm also startled by the term medieval in relation to Taliban's brutal rule in the 1990s. Scholars have pointed out that medieval Afghanistan and medieval Islam in many other places looked nothing like the Taliban's policies. What are your thoughts on Islamic and Afghan scholars who have shown that the Taliban's restrictive and violent imagination of Islam is a modern phenomenon, a point we have to emphasize so that we don't further orientalize Afghanistan or replicate racialized war on terror terms of the world? And then I'm going to take one last question here from Mohammed Farouk. If I may, my second question is regarding Pakistan's interference in Afghanistan, given the ISIS role in supporting the Mujahideen and the cheering of Taliban's takeover as a victory of Pakistan. How do you look at the Pakistan-Afghan relationship, and how much a role will the controversy over the Rwand line play in the Taliban 2.0 relationship with the Pakistani military establishment? So that's a quite involved question. Well, would you like to start us off here? And we have just 5 minutes, so if you could try to be brief, just a couple of minutes. Thank you.
I will, and I'll take two of the points that Leila made. I started to type out an answer to her, but let me just very quickly say something about that. The brutality of the DRA. All states have a repressive apparatus. All states can be very brutal. The American state, the French state, the British state, the Afghan state, I mean, all of them. I myself come from a country with a rather brutal regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which back in the early 80s, actually as early as the summer of 1979, was responsible for torture, arrest, persecution, executions, and of course the exile, the forced displacement of thousands of Iranians, thousands of Iranian leftists, communists, etc. And by the way, when I went to Afghanistan in January, February of 1989, as the last of the Soviet troops were leaving, I actually encountered many of those Iranian communists who had been given refuge by the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, by the ruling PDPA. They were given housing, they were given jobs, and they were given dignity and a livelihood. So yes, it is true that all states, including the Afghan state, are responsible for brutality against their own citizens, especially when they are challenged. That's as true of the United States as any other country. And of course, that includes Iran, Afghanistan, etc. But that does not justify deliberately destabilizing a state and wreaking havoc on an entire population and its trajectory and development. So yes, there were uprisings in the early part of the DRA rule, but the way I have read Afghan history is that the Afghan government at the time, the left-wing government, could have prevailed had it not been for the US determination to destabilize and undermine that government and to try to create this Soviet-style quagmire for the Soviet Union. As for the other part of your question having to do with, just one more thing about brutality of regimes. I have been extremely critical of the Islamic regime of Iran for what it did to its dissidents in the 1980s, throughout the 1980s, actually into the 1990s too. But I am adamantly, totally, wholeheartedly opposed to any form of external intervention, not to mention invasions of my country. And I'm also opposed to the sanctions. Medieval, all right, perhaps that was a misplaced term. But the fact that the Mujahideen were an appalling group. I don't want to get into the detail. I don't think we should really, argue about that. Yes, there were 7 groups within the Mujahideen, but they started to fight against each other in the most appalling manner. And the Taliban also, banning kite running, banning music, holding public executions, denying women the right to come out of the house without being fully shrouded and accompanied by a male. Please, if this is modernity, yes, modernity has a lot of problems, like, fascism was part of modernity too. But the Taliban were a pretty appalling state of affairs back then. And right now, they're not looking very good either. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. Arash, would you like to say a few last words before we conclude?
It's hard to conclude and top what my other esteemed panelists I think have said, and just a second, especially what Gonzalo said, like we are here in the diaspora are kind of doing what we have to do because we are creations of U.S. foreign policy and Western foreign policy, and because countries like Pakistan have allowed to be a proxy sponsor of the Taliban, and so I think I want to just convey that the West has an obligation, the United States has an obligation, but it's not a political one only. Of course, we're going to need to hold policymakers accountable, but I think every person holds an obligation. Professor Ali, you started with talking about how we've all kind of been complicit. I think the diaspora itself has some self-reflection to do and what role it could have played in the past 20 years. Too many of us probably looked away or profited from this occupation. And I think so. What I want to convey is that everybody kind of holds a moral obligation, whether that looks like doing a donation drive here for newly arrived people or to push for a moment politically, because I think what we have seen in the past few years is that we are moving towards a better world where we do value Black and brown bodies, and we are starting to kind of think about that, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement here. We're in this like paradigm shift. But what I'm disheartened by, what I think we can do better, is to also value Black and brown bodies overseas. That when we were thinking of bombing a foreign country like Yemen, or starving a foreign country like Yemen or Afghanistan or even Iran, and thinking of sanction, and we just look away and continue with our day to read a book or to go to the park, or and try to find our ways, and trying to find some joy in our everyday lives here, to also continue to think about what that means for people that do not have the privilege that the three of us here and the four of us here had on this panel, and to continue to think critically, and to value Afghan lives in the way they haven't been before.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arash. I very much agree with you. I learned from all of you. I'm humbled by what you all said, and I do hope that those of us who listened via the webinar or YouTube or later on the recording, will be able to share some of the lessons and the possibilities also of action. I mean, one of the things that we are trying to do at university, I mean, I remember from also the Iraq situation, it's just a small group, but there will be actually thousands of Afghani academics who will be trying to flee. So it is upon us, universities in Western context, to host students, to host academics. I mean, there are, small things, but I think we all have to do something, if it's lobbying senators or, trying to lobby our university administrators. So I'd like to thank you all, Val, Majgan, and Arash. I'd like to thank the audience, and I wish you all the best, and hopefully we will have another occasion to discuss the future of Afghanistan. I mean, there's so much more to say, of course. Thank you very much.